Hello. For this learning objective, we're going to be talking specifically about the stomach, which is the compartment right after the esophagus. The stomach is this pouch that looks like a J-shaped structure that will connect the esophagus to the first compartment of the small intestine, which is the duodenum, which is the structure right over here. Although you do have this minimal amount of carbohydrate digestion occurring in the mouth, the chemical digestion really gets underway in the stomach. There are going to be four main regions in the stomach, which are the cardia, the fundus, the body, and the pylorus. The cardia, which can also be called the cardiac region, is going to be the point where the esophagus connects to the stomach and through which the food will pass into the stomach. And it's going to be located inferior to the diaphragm, and above and to the left of the cardia is going to be this dome-shaped fundus. So the fundus is like the dead end of the stomach. So this means that from here, the food has nowhere to go to. Below the fundus is the body, which is the main part of the stomach. And then from the body, it goes to this funnel-shaped structure, which is called the pylorus, which will be the one that will connect the stomach to the duodenum. And it connects it to the duodenum through another sphincter that's called the pyloric sphincter. So it sort of makes sense that the last compartment is called the pylorus, that will end in the pyloric sphincter that controls the emptying of the stomach into the small intestine. A few of the functions of the stomach are listed here. First, we have mixing and churning of the food. This occurs not only because of some folds that we have in the stomach, which we will see in the next slide, but also the pyloric sphincter does create this churning because the contents from the stomach, they get pushed from the cardia all the way to the pylorus, and because the sphincter stays closed, then it sort of returns back up to the cardia. So it sort of creates this mixing movement back and forth and a churning movement, and this is what helps to break down the contents of the stomach. The other thing that's important to know is that once the food reaches the stomach, it receives the name of chyme. So if it's in the mouth, once you chew, it becomes the bolus. Once it starts to come down the esophagus, it's still the bolus. Once it starts to be broken down in the stomach, it becomes what we call the chyme. And the formation of the chyme occurs due to this chemical breakdown of proteins from this churning and mixing movement. Now, once the chyme is ready to move on to the next compartment, it will get released into the duodenum, where the fat-soluble substance will be able to be absorbed. And we will see how this will happen once we get to the small intestine. Additionally, because the stomach is very acidic due to the presence of hydrochloric acid, it does possess this antimicrobial function because no pathogen is able to survive this acidity. The stomach also has important functions with regards to stimulating enzymes that will be able to digest protein, and it's also important for secreting intrinsic factor, which is required for vitamin B12 absorption in the small intestine. With regards to the stomach musculature, notice how it will contain two extra muscle layers. We're going to find the muscularis mucosae, which is located right over here in the mucosa, and in the muscularis externa, besides the circular muscle layer and the longitudinal muscle layer, we're also going to find the oblique muscle layer. And both these extra layers, they're going to be important because They will not only give strength to the stomach wall, but they will help to perform the mixing and the churning, which are very important to break down the chyme inside of the stomach. And why do you think it's important to have extra muscle layers in the stomach wall? Well, basically, for the nutrients to be able to be absorbed, they need to be broken down. And for them to be broken down, this churning and mixing needs to be efficient. And this is why these muscle layers are very important for the churning and the mixing to be very efficient in breaking down the chyme into smaller and smaller particles to be able to have an effective absorption once they reach the small intestine. Also, we see that we have these structures that are called rugae right over here. And these rugaes, they are these longitudinal folds that form what we call these gastric pits. And the gastric pits, they actually permit us to have these gastric lumen expansion. So when we eat, our stomach is able to expand. And when our stomach is empty, then they form these gastric pits again, and this allows our stomach to recoil. This mechanism is very important because one of the places that food content can be stored is in the stomach. And this mechanism is what we call receptive relaxation. So the more you eat, the more relaxed your stomach gets, and the more you can store in your stomach. So this is why when they have these hot dogs competition and people can eat like 70 hot dogs at once, because your stomach is able to expand in a way by relaxing the muscle to allow for this expansion. The other thing that's a little bit different in the stomach is the type of peristalsis that occurs in the stomach, which is called retropulsion. So because the pyloric sphincter always stays closed except for the passage of water, then it sort of creates this churning movement that breaks down the contents even more. And this is what we call retropulsion. With regards to the epithelium of the stomach, it's made up of simple columnar epithelium. And because the stomach is very acidic, then the first cells on top are what we call the surface mucus cells. And they will secrete this alkaline mucus that will protect the lining of the stomach. Then we have what we call the mucus neck cells that will secrete this very thin acidic mucus. Then we have another one which are called the G cells. And the G cells will secrete gastrin, which we will see in the next slide, the function of gastrin. Then we have what we call the chief cells. Chief cells will secrete pepsinogen, which we will also see on the next slide, the function of pepsinogen. And then the last type of cells are the parietal cells. Parietal cells, they will secrete hydrochloric acid and also intrinsic factor, which, as we already know, is required for the absorption of vitamin B12 in the small intestine. Let's talk now about the digestive properties in the stomach. First, we have gastrin, which is going to be secreted by the stomach mucosa, mainly by the G cells of the pyloric antrum. And this hormone is secreted when it's stimulated in the presence of peptides and amino acids in the stomach. Once gastrin is present in the stomach, it increases the secretion by the gastric glands, and this promotes the gastric emptying. Therefore, the contents will go from the stomach into the small intestine. And then gastrin in the small intestine promotes the intestinal muscle contraction. So it stimulates it to contract to be able to break down further the chyme. Once it reaches the ileocecal valve, which basically is the last compartment of the small intestine before it enters the large intestine, then it relaxes the valve to allow the contents that are in the small intestine to enter into the large intestine. And then once in the large intestine, gastrin will trigger again what we call mass movements, which then will create this, like the name suggests, a mass movement that will promote defecation and eliminate the contents from the large intestine. Next, we have somatostatin, which is going to be a hormone that will be produced by the mucosa of the stomach, more specifically in the pyloric antrum and also in the duodenum. What makes it be secreted is the presence of food in the stomach and also stimulation from the sympathetic nervous system. Where will it act? Well, if it's in the stomach, it will restrict all of the gastric secretions, the gastric motility, and the emptying. Because remember that the sympathetic nervous system in the digestive system, it actually functions to inhibit the digestive functions. And if it's in the pancreas, it will restrict the pancreatic secretions. And if it's in the small intestine, it will reduce the intestinal absorption by reducing the blood flow. Next, we have two hormones, which are histamine and serotonin. Both are going to be produced in the stomach. Both will be released due to the presence of food in the stomach, and they will also target the stomach. Now, histamine will stimulate the parietal cells to release hydrochloric acid, and serotonin will contract the stomach muscles. And lastly, we have ghrelin, which is going to be produced also in the stomach, and it will be stimulated when your stomach is empty, so during the fasting period, and it will target the hypothalamus, which basically is going to be the organ that will regulate the food intake, primarily by stimulating hunger and satiety. Now, the secretion of all these gastric juices is going to be controlled by both the nerves and the hormones. So stimuli in the brain, in the stomach, and in the small intestine, they will activate or inhibit the gastric juice production. And this is why the three phases of gastric secretion are called the cephalic, the gastric, and the intestinal phases. However, once the gastric secretion begins, then all three phases will occur simultaneously, meaning at the same time. First, we have the cephalic phase, which basically is what we call a reflexive phase of the gastric secretion, which is actually relatively brief, and it takes place before food even enters the stomach. So the smell, the taste, the sight, or even the thought of food might trigger this phase. So for example, when you bring a piece of sushi to your lips, there are going to be certain impulses from receptors in your taste buds or the nose that are going to be relayed to your brain, which return signals that increase the gastric secretion to prepare your stomach for digestion. And this enhanced secretion is a conditioned reflex, meaning that it occurs only if you like or you want a particular food. If you don't like a food, then you will not have this stimulus. Also, if you're going through a period of depression or loss of appetite, then it can be suppressed as well. Now, the gastric phase of secretion lasts about 3 to 4 hours and is set in motion by these local neural or even hormonal mechanisms that are going to be triggered by the entry of food into the stomach. So, for example, when your sushi reaches the stomach, then it creates this distension that activates the stretch receptors. And this stimulates the parasympathetic neurons to release acetylcholine, which then provokes increased secretion of the gastric juice. So, for example, partially digested proteins, caffeine, and rising pH will stimulate the release of gastrin from the enteroendocrine G cells, which in turn induces the parietal cells to increase their production of hydrochloric acid, which is going to be needed to create this acidic environment for the conversion of pepsinogen to pepsin. And then this causes protein digestion. So additionally, the release of gastrin will activate this vigorous smooth muscle contraction. Then we have the intestinal phase of the gastric secretion that has both excitatory and inhibitory elements. So the duodenum, which is the first compartment of the small intestine, it has a major role in regulating the stomach and its emptying. So when partially digested food or chyme fills the duodenum, then intestinal mucosal cells, they will release a hormone that's called enteric gastrin, which will further excite the gastric juice secretion. Now, this stimulatory activity is actually very brief. However, because when the intestine distends with the chyme entering, there's going to be this enterogastric reflex that inhibits the secretion. And one of the effects of this reflex is to actually close the pyloric sphincter, which then blocks additional chyme from entering the duodenum. So it basically controls the empty of the stomach into the small intestine.